coming in to join the session, but in the interest of time and with due respect to everybody who's on time, I would like to begin. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting in today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. I think it's important that we are also beginning with this invocation and recognition of the indigenous people and the original inhabitants of the land, because we are talking about the subject which is going to be discussed, which is feminist foreign policy, which is actually all about inclusion and equity. For today's session, let me first introduce the speakers. We have an esteemed set of panelists here, and we have Ambassador Eduardo Peña, Embassy of Mexico. We have Dr. Andreas Radtke, Deputy Head of Mission, Embassy of Federal Republic of Germany. We have Ambika Vishwanath, Founder and Director of Kubernein Initiative, India. We have Ofakilevuka, Director of the Women and Children Crisis Center, Tonga. And we have Bettina Baldeschi. She's the CEO of the International Women's Development Agency. So those are our extremely well recognized, esteemed panelists who have been working on this issue as part of think tanks and as a part of government. Now, this particular session is actually co-hosted by the Asia Foundation and the International Women's Development Agency. Very briefly about the foundation, I think a lot of you probably been hearing about us in all the other sessions that you have been attending. We are basically a nonprofit international development agency. We have offices in 18 countries across Asia and the Pacific, and our programs cut across gender, women's empowerment, good governance, inclusive economic growth, environment, climate action, and regional and international relations. The foundation is an organization with a long history of presence and footprint in the Asia and the Pacific region. Our co-host is the International Women's Development Agency, IWDA, as some of you may know, is an Australia-based organization resourcing women's rights organizations in Asia and the Pacific and working with global feminist movement to advance the vision of gender equality for all. IWDA convenes the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition, a diverse network of individuals and organizations advancing feminist foreign policy in Australia. So the two organizations, the representative of both the organizations, plus our esteemed panelists, all of us were really pleased to welcome all of you here today from think tanks, universities, civil society organizations, and diplomatic corps. Let me begin by just putting a kind of a little bit of a background context to this conversation that we are going to have now. I think recently what we have been seeing is an increasing cohort of countries which have been talking about having a more gendered and in some places more directly a feminist approach in relation to their foreign policy, and in some places in relation to international cooperation, not fully extending to foreign policy, but international cooperation. It's largely been the countries from the global north, with, of course, the exception of Mexico and also more recently Libya in Africa. The discourse started with Sweden in 2014, and some of us have been following Sweden in the fact that it has actually gone back on calling its foreign policy feminist. I, however, have to say that I was at a recent meeting in Malaysia where the Swedish ambassador to Malaysia actually pointed out the fact that they may not be using the term feminist foreign policy, but it doesn't take away the ethos of what they are intending to do with their foreign policy approach. And I think that's also something interesting to talk about and see how much of what we do in the foreign policy space towards equity, inclusion, greater voices, greater peace and prosperity, how much of that really should be framed within the framework of calling it feminist versus using any other terminology. I have my personal opinion about it, but we'll not talk about that at this point. In the past 2 years, of course, we have also seen Spain and Germany. We're very happy also to have with us from the German embassy, Dr. Radtke. And we've been hearing about how some of these countries, including Chile and Netherlands, have framed their foreign policy discourse. In Australia as well, I think we are hearing a much more stronger voice where the Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong has emphasized First Nation people and culture as a central part of who Australia is in the world, and that to a great extent also determines how Australia would and moving forward, is going to be looking at its own foreign policy. Momentum is also building from the civil society with the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition about expanding the range of voices participating in foreign policy debates. India, where we also have Ambika from Kubernein, is, again, world's biggest democracy and does not really yet have a stated feminist foreign policy framework. But there is considerable interest now in the last few years, and evidence on gender being a key consideration on its internal and external actions and on development cooperation. India hasn't really articulated any official voice about having a feminist foreign policy, but I do want to quote the Indian External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, at a press interview, I think in 2001, when he was asked about, is India going to be looking at a feminist foreign policy? And I quote, he said that India needs to have a gender balance in its foreign policy and look at three things: getting more women to engage with foreign policy issues, reflect women's interest in foreign policy, and bring in a feminist perspective in foreign policy. So there clearly is an interest, even though I think we haven't reached the stage where an articulation of that at a policy level is happening. It's also interesting that more countries from the South. I was in Malaysia last week, and my colleague from Malaysia, Anthea, is here. And this was at a workshop hosted by IDRF, that's the Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations. And IDRF was actually hosting a conversation with Malaysian think tanks, government representatives, and other foreign representatives in Malaysia about the possibility and options for Malaysia adopting a feminist foreign policy. Again, there is always a lot of discomfort sometimes around the word feminist, and so I think the attempt to say, is it a gendered foreign policy, or is it, do we really need to say feminist? Again, we will hear from the specialists and experts. There is a split house. I think some would claim that keeping the word feminist is important because it actually helps you in the long run to really deconstruct the patriarchal powers and norms. Gendered foreign policy is a good start, but I guess one will have to see how countries decide to do it. The other final thing that I'd like to say and stop here is, I think in the global South today, there is also a greater demand for really unpacking this whole, the construct or the lens of a feminist foreign policy from a very, very local context. So what's the Southern perspective on what a feminist foreign policy should be? What is the contextual reality of the global South about having a feminist foreign policy? How is it going to play out with our institutions? These are questions we've got asked in India when we've been working on, talking about the feminist foreign policy and moving the discourse forward. Apprehension around the word feminist itself, but also sometimes apprehensions thinking that, is this something that we are just being asked to do because it's happened more in the global North? And I think navigating that space in a way that we craft this conversation in countries who are engaging more and more in the global stage today, whether it's on conflict, whether it's on disaster, whether it's on renewable energy, whether it's on basic issues of equity and armament. I think the global South's engagement in all of these specters across the world requires for us to be able to navigate this space with a more contextualized understanding and framing of feminist foreign policy. How we do that is going to be interesting. We are working at it in some of the countries, but I think I'm going to look to hear from our speakers on how we go about it. So the session is going to be broken up into two. One, I acknowledge this room is extremely warm. This is my back-to-back session in this room, so I'm sorry I took off my jacket. I just couldn't handle it. Apologies. But in order to make sure that we kind of, are able to be a part of the conversation, we are first going to have our two, diplomatic speakers start off with their presentation. So I'm going to first call on Ambassador Peña from Mexico to make his presentation, and after that, we will have Dr. Andreas Radtke, Deputy Head of Mission from the Embassy of Federal Republic of Germany, make his presentation. We will then take a break for Q&A. And after that, we will go back to the panel discussions with our other panelists. That way, I'm hoping we can take the heat and be, more engaging, or maybe ramp up the heat with the questions that we may have for the diplomatic corps people. So with that, I would like to invite first Ambassador Eduardo Peña, Embassy of Mexico, to please make his presentation. Ambassador.
Thank you very much to everybody. It's a great honor to be here with you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I am grateful for the opportunity the International Women's Development Agency gave me to share with all of you the Mexican feminist foreign policy, particularly to Mrs. Bettina Valdesky. Before addressing the central topic of this talk, I consider important to review some information about Mexico and the history and policies with respect to women's participation in the public sphere. I will begin by pointing out that my country is a representative, democratic, federal and secular republic made up of 32 states with 130 million people, where 52% is female. Women's movement to participate in the public sphere started in the 19th century, but it wasn't until 1953 that the Constitution was reformed so that Mexican women, for the first time, could vote and be voted for at the national level. In 2011, all the human rights of international treaties were incorporated as constitutional rights, which not only forced the federal and state congresses to reform the laws accordingly and to establish total parity, which required all public institutions to be made up of equal numbers of men and women. Hence, the current cabinet of ministers is close to total parity, 10 men and 8 women. The Supreme Court is made up of 4 women and 5 men. Women represent 78% of the Senate, and 50% of the House of Representatives is female. This total parity has led to important reforms in areas that were hitherto neglected, such as the prohibition of child marriage, the elimination of VAT on menstrual products, the general law on women's access to a life free of violence, the approval of the National Program for Equality between Women and Men, the criminalization of cybersexual offenses, and the access to child care for working men, to name a few. The purpose of this introduction is to point out that the adoption of a feminist foreign policy by Mexico in the year 2020 is the result of a social movement that demanded equality between men and women while including other marginalized groups. The feminist foreign policy is a public policy that contributes to achieve gender equality around the world and is based on a set of principles that seek, through foreign policy, to promote government actions to replace and eliminate structural differences and gender inequalities. Mexico's feminist foreign policy approach incorporates human rights, gender perspective, intersectionality, and the visibility of women's contribution to foreign policy and global action. It is made up of 5 axes. First, a feminist agenda that aims to lead international efforts on gender equality through concrete actions with a gender perspective, like the Women's Peace and Security Agenda. Second, total parity in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in order to eradicate the gender gap. Third, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs safe for all and free of violence, harassment, and sexism. Fourth, visibility of the representation and participation of women in the Mexican Foreign Service. Fifth, intersectional feminism that tackles the sources of additional discrimination, such as belonging to a minority group. Mexico's feminist foreign policy has seen several achievements within the ministry and at regional and multilateral levels. Within the ministry, amendments to the Mexican Foreign Service law to eliminate structural differences and gender disparities. The implementation of comprehensive women's consular desks in all our consulates in the US, we have 50 there, that offer legal assistance, entrepreneurial advice, amongst many services. At the regional level, in 2020, a joint declaration of the Pacific Alliance recognized gender equality as an essential condition to achieve prosperous, peaceful, and sustainable societies, and agreed on a roadmap to promote women's empowerment. At a multilateral level, Mexico ratified in 2020 the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, and Related Intolerance, and in 21 and 22, two conventions of the International Labor Organization, namely the Domestic Workers Convention and the Violence and Harassment Convention. During the COP27, Mexico presented its National Action Plan on Gender and Climate Change, which aims to incorporate a gender perspective in national actions towards climate change mitigation and adaptation. In 2021, Mexico and France co-chaired the Generation Equality Forum convened by the UN Women, whose agenda includes issues such as gender-based violence, justice and economic rights, and sexual and reproductive rights, among others. In conclusion, I would like to point out that Mexico's feminist foreign policy goes beyond declarations and good intentions and is aimed at empowering historically disadvantaged segments of the population, addressing structural causes and transforming power relations while recognizing and protecting the rights of women and girls. However, it is also necessary to recognize that there is still a long way to go to incorporate a feminist approach in Mexican international relations, as well as to mainstream a gender perspective in national institutions. In this context, a fundamental element that must be resolved is the allocation of greater economic resources to promote public policies for the prevention, punishment, reparation, and ultimately the eradication of violence and discriminations against women and girls. It is also necessary to deepen the parity that should prevail in the structure and organization of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which has an opportunity to contribute to the materialization of feminist policies. Mexico's feminist foreign policy seeks to ensure that its national policies effectively incorporate feminism as a way to transform the reality of discrimination and violence suffered by women, but at the same time faces the challenge of guaranteeing the human rights of women and girls. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like now to invite Dr. Andreas Radtke.
This one, okay, very good. So, yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me in this panel. It's a very important topic to the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, and we're very grateful that the organizers have involved us and approached us to participate in this exercise. My name is Andreas Radtke. I've been posted here in Australia for the last 3 years, but I'm a serial offender. I've been posted here before because I'm married to an Australian colleague, and I've otherwise been posted to the Middle East and to Malaysia and to Indonesia. So there's some knowledge of the region. I'll try and do my best to explain where we stand on feminist foreign policy. It's terminologically still a bit new, I guess, but something that is very much close to the heart of our current foreign minister and of the Federal Foreign Office. So, but at the outset, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people. And as Nandita has already pointed out, it's particularly important because of the cross connections between the issue we are talking about today and First Nations foreign policy. I will try to very briefly outline where we stand as the Federal Foreign Office and as the federal government of Germany in addressing the idea of a feminist foreign policy. I'll go a little bit just into what our ambition is into this and what our objectives are, and the rationale behind it, and the idea that we want to produce guidelines. We are not quite as far advanced, I believe, as our Mexican colleagues are, but we are getting there, hopefully next year. I'll try and speak a little bit to the challenges that I believe that are still there to overcome, some of which have already been mentioned in the introduction, and the observations we've been making. And then hopefully that would lead to having some ideas as to how we want to handle that in the upcoming years in the regional context here in the Indo-Pacific. But I have to say I'll be a lot in a listening mode there, because I think we've got a lot of people who have a lot to say on that here in the audience and on the panel. And as we are still in the process of setting this up, it's really important to listen, and I'll point out for which particular steps on the way I think that will be important for us. I need to click myself, or... there we go. Starting with the ambition. So Germany has a new government since December 2021. We're almost in the 1-year term of 4 years. It's a complicated coalition of the Social Democrats in the lead with Chancellor Scholz, Liberal Democrats, and the Green Party. And the Green Party is covering two currently very particularly exposed fields: foreign policy. Annalena Baerbock is our minister at the Federal Foreign Office. But also climate and energy and climate action and economy, which is also in green hands, and an issue that is, or covering issues that are currently at the forefront of the international agenda. So when Germany forms a new government, we always have a coalition treaty so that the parties don't start bickering straight away. And that coalition treaty states what you can read on the slide. We want to strengthen rights, resources, and representation. So there you've got our 3 R's of women and girls, and help increase diversity in societies globally. We want to second more women into positions of international leadership, and ambitiously move forward and develop further our national plan of action in implementing UN Resolution 1325. So that is just the context that was given as the ambition for this government in a whole of government approach. But obviously this is for the Foreign Office for a large part to implement. Now the current objective of the Federal Foreign Office is that we develop guidelines for feminist foreign policy until March next year. I think looking at the slides of the Mexican government there, you've already got quite a few points nailed down, which I believe we will also then address in those guidelines. At the moment, we are in an intensive consultation process that is meant to include international partners, civil society, and then also our own Federal Foreign Office staff, which was also something that was reflected in the Mexican presentation. We had a very important milestone on the way towards those guidelines with the conference on shaping feminist foreign policy, which was held in September in Berlin, but also with online participation, and which had a keynote speech by our minister. I don't know, I sent it around. I don't know whether it can be distributed to the participants. We also had conclusions of the chair in the end, which pointed out a bit what the main findings of this conference were. And I think maybe most importantly, we had really a number of workshops which involve policymakers as well as civil society representatives that looked at a number of individual issues in the context of feminist foreign policy. We had a very good high-level political participation. It was indeed mostly global north, but there were a couple of other representatives. There was a representative from Afghanistan. There was a representative from Rwanda. Mexico was there as well. So we are getting towards a more inclusive and broader participation in this. Yeah, I might just say a few words about the role, I think, specifically of the Green Party in this. So it is, of course, maybe the party that has a specific approach to federal government and when it comes to foreign policy, and there's a generally, how would I say, progressive agenda also in domestic politics that ties in really well with what we want to try to achieve with feminist foreign policy. It's as becomes clear from the involvement in the conference and in the workshops and in bringing about those guidelines, a very comprehensive endeavor where, as the Federal Foreign Office, we want to tie in as many people as possible. That's our international partners, of course, and then civil society organizations, both home and abroad. And I understand that Ambika is already involved in some of these consultations with her organization. We have similar challenges like everywhere else. The work starts sort of internally. It's an important element of shaping and developing feminist foreign policy that we first look at who is shaping that foreign policy, and that is the colleagues at the Federal Foreign Office. We are also on an ambitious plan to get to gender equality, gender equity in positions. It's a long path. We have not come as far as we would have liked to have come, but we are making good progress. And I want to be very open about this. That is not something that is easily done, because it does always involve, the existing power structures, the existing gender balance, and it is something that can at times be relatively fiercely internally debated. It ties in with a number of other debates that we have in society. In the German case, for example, about gender and language, where there is still quite a lively debate, to put it neutrally. So it's a larger project. So why are we doing this? Going to the rationale of the feminist foreign policy. From an internal paper I took this, it says gender equality and equitable participation are preconditions to realize our core interests of achieving and maintaining sustainable peace and security. Now, why I'm quoting that specific sentence, there is here a really direct connection in our thinking about this to international peace and security. And that is why this is going to tie in very much with other endeavors that are currently going on in German foreign policy. We have committed in the same coalition treaty to delivering a first ever national security strategy for Germany, something we haven't done so far. It's meant to come out towards the end of this year or early in the next year. We are also working on a number of other strategies, but that I would think is the key one in this context. And obviously that national security strategy will take a very broad view of what security is. That will not just involve our physical, in terms of military means and so on, our physical security, although that is an issue that in the current situation with the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has come a lot more to the forefront again. But it's not just that, it's also protecting our democracy, our values, and it's about protecting our livelihoods, including obviously the issue of climate change. And we believe that a feminist foreign policy approach to that is something that will upgrade these efforts at every step of the way in this broad approach. Yeah, and as I said, conversations such as this one must feed into these guidelines. We want to The guidelines are meant to define the scope of our feminist foreign policy and embed it into this broader framework, and then also start spelling out concrete approaches to various fields of actions that are listed here: human rights promotion, humanitarian assistance, peace building and stabilization efforts, climate change policies, some of which are also the highlights in our action plan in implementing Resolution 1325. Move on to some of the challenges and misconceptions. I must apologize. This will say a few things that everybody in the room knows. I still put them on the slide. It's a method, not a field of action that we are talking about. While we may have a new box in the org chart of the Federal Foreign Office, it is all about streamlining. And then I wrote something there which is maybe a little bit controversial. That's why it has a footnote, just to explain that. So it's not about focusing on women and girls as victims, but as agents of change. Well, that doesn't exclude that we address victim situations, obviously, and in the conference we had, because of the political situation, there was quite a strong focus on the situation in Afghanistan, the situation in Ukraine, and feminist perspectives on things that were going badly wrong and that needed addressing. So that was obviously a large part of the workshop work in the conference. But more broadly speaking, and one doesn't exclude the other, the focus is on having women and girls there as empowered agents of change, and how we can bring that about in our in shaping our foreign policy. So we might maybe go more into the question of where we need to address victim situations in the discussion. I don't want to go into too much detail just now. And then on the challenges and misconceptions, I don't need to go too much into that as well, because Nandita has already mentioned it. There's some dangers here in terms of the terminology that we use, that this is misunderstood or is not appreciated in certain contexts in the Global South. And that is something that we need to be very aware of. It was something that came up in those workshops time and again. And I think that will be usefully addressed in those guidelines as well. But I would be very interested specifically on those issues to listen to the discussion and be part of the discussion that is coming in the second part, because that's where the challenges are. Very last slide, very quickly, just something that also came out of those workshops and which I found particularly interesting. There's still a lot of it's all work in progress still, right? And there's still a lot of difficulties in having the right data in addressing certain things. We are pretty good already when it comes to our feminist development policy, simply because it's relatively easier to have a good work plan and roadmap if you can quantize things. And in terms of development policy, we have indicators that are easily sort of identified, and we can, and our Ministry of Aid, the BMZ, has just come up in a report to Parliament as to what their roadmap is for having a better feminist development policy, and they can simply outline how they want to do gender budgeting in terms of how we use the funds that we have at our disposal. It's particularly challenging in times when funds are generally going down, but I think they're doing not such a bad job of it. And then another thing that I found very interesting that came out of those workshops is that in terms of economic empowerment, there's still a lot of, was universally decried, that there's a lack of data on having a gender-sensitive data generation, which would be the basis for coming up with good ideas for how you can address economic imbalances that are gender-based. So that was something maybe also we could take into the discussion with us. I don't want to leave the Indo-Pacific out totally. We are obviously here as foreign policy agents in the region. We are here with a big aid program in parts of the region. And of course, a lot of things are already being addressed. I could say, for example, for the work of this embassy, that we are also accredited to PNG, and we are working with NGOs there in the context of the Bougainville peace process, and in the work there, the gender aspect and the gender criteria play an important role, because women are very much involved in mediation efforts, in conflict prevention efforts, and we are supporting that through NGO work. It's one way. In the South Pacific, we are now trying to be more engaged. We are looking at the consequences of climate change, and in that context, we will very much look at the role of women as well. And then there are other things that come to mind with current crises that we might want to discuss. I'm thinking of the situation in Myanmar, for example, where it will all be about accountability, about fighting impunity, possibly in the aftermath of what's happening there. And those are all issues where in the Indo-Pacific, I think we can make a big change if we move towards a more feminist paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Radtke, and may I just request also Ambassador Peña to join us here at the table. We'll take two quick questions now for the two ambassadors. And hands up first gets, okay, right there in the middle, and here, second. And then, of course, there'll be more time for questions, but at this point, we'll just take two for the two speakers who have just presented, and then we'll go in for a more discussion with the entire panel, and we'll have more time for Q&A. Yes, ma'am, please.
Thank you. It's a very opening up. Thank you for the presentation, inspiring. So I have a couple of very straightforward questions. One is, so I'm working in this sector, taking ZC lanes for several years. So what I found every time, every year, every project is, so people, they fear being feminist. They want all these things. They like all this like feminist content and everything, but they don't want to be like a level as feminist. So that's like a entry barrier, I would say. So that's hindering us to go further. And then another one is, yes, definitely girls and women and all other marginalized. They are not only the victims, but also the change agent. But we are far away because feminist issue, often what I have seen, it's taken as an issue that gender specialist feminists has to deal with. Then my comment here, I think for everyone is how to make this agenda as everyone's agenda, every development project's agenda, not only feminist or women's agenda.
Can I stop you on those
yes,
two questions, please?
Sure.
I'm going to move to the other speaker person here who had a question, and then we will answer both, if that's okay, yeah, in the interest of time. Yes.
So I'm conscious that I think there probably is a gender imbalance at the conference overall, but there's a really big gender imbalance here in the room, like with every conversation around gender or any pro-feminist or any kind of, frankly, most inclusion discussions. So I suppose my question to the both of you is, internally within your foreign offices, how crucial has it been to have the engagement and ownership and commitment of men in order to advance this? Or has there been able to be results without men's participation?
Yeah, whoever would like to go. And Ambassador Peña, would you like to respond?
I can try. I can go first. Is this on now, or this is on, right? Yeah. No, I mean, thanks for both of those questions. Starting with the first one, I mean, I'm probably not the best placed person to address that. I think it's just important to point out that I think from our perspective in the Federal Foreign Office, there is this understanding that a feminist discourse is potentially a discourse that is a Western-rooted discourse that will need to be translated in order to be appreciated in various contexts. I was not surprised to hear in the introduction that in Malaysia, having lived there for 3 years, that it is tricky to work with those labels, and sometimes turning the labels around a little bit is already helping. I had put the formula on one of the slides and then I think failed to read it, but it was the formula that was used, I believe, in the chair statement that we had from the conference, the conclusions of the chair, where the words we then used were the commitment to a foreign policy in which gender equality, women's rights, and the equal, full, and meaningful participation of all parts of society is central. So that's maybe not the solution to everything, but it's a different kind of formula of putting what we want to achieve, and depending on the context, I mean, I think it's already a good first step if we have acknowledged that that is something we need to be mindful of and work with our partners in the countries and regions where we try to engage on these issues. And just very on the second question, we didn't only start with our first female foreign minister, who's been in power now since December 2021. Her predecessor, Heiko Maas, made a huge effort in trying to get our statistics into a better place. Even just in the federal foreign government comparison, foreign offices tend to sometimes be particularly male-dominated for various reasons that are deeply rooted still in our societies in terms of who chooses these kind of jobs and who takes a step back when families develop and so on. So I think we've had for a long time had the awareness that this is something we need to address, not just on the gender and gender equality front. We've also, for the last 4 or 5 years now, had a group that addresses diplomats of color, which is still hugely underrepresented by comparison to German society as a whole in the Federal Foreign Office, and the same for people with handicaps and so on. So we have tried to address this. Yes, indeed, the room reflects things, but...
I think we'll have more on the discussion as we go, but Ambassador Peña, would you like to add something to that? Especially, I think, to the point of saying that you do have women on the table in Mexico, but how important was it to have the support of the men to push through the policies?
Well, I have to say that now Mexican society is aware of the problem related with women's discrimination and violence. So I think everybody is convinced that we have to change. And now the society is pushing everybody to change, especially politicians and public officials are worried about these topics. And well, I think that's good. We're facing many problems, but 15 years ago, nobody talked about this topic. You could not read information about women discrimination or women against violence. And today, if you read newspapers, you will see that everything has changed, and officials are taking note. And in regard to the Mexican Foreign Service, I want to state that we have already had 3 foreign ministers that were women. Right. And our foreign service is not very big. We're about 1,200 people, and we're accustomed to work with the women, and I think, and because of the topics that we deal with in the international arena, we think there is no resistance.
There is no other option but to change.
Yes, and now something that has to be changed is that now we have more ambassadors that are men and less ladies as ambassadors. But we have to if you want to go into the Mexican Foreign Service, you have to compete for a place. There are exams. And now you will see that in Mexico, women are getting very well prepared. And slowly but surely, numbers are going to become equal.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go to, yes. Yes, I was coming to you, actually, Ambika, in any case, in terms of, yes, the participation issue on who decides. Is it women or men? Yeah.
So, hi, I'm Ambika Vishwanath, and to answer your question a little bit, I've been doing this now for 3+ years, in that I've been studying the feminist foreign policy movement globally, sitting in India, which is very different when you sit in India and look at all of this, what's happening. And I've been in a lot of discussions of this nature in several countries in Europe and in the US, but also because of COVID online, so they're all over the world. And I have to say, I counted 9 men. I'm sorry if I missed any out, but definitely 9. That is more number of men I've seen in a room of this kind of a discussion. So yay to Australia on that. However, what the ambassador said about the numbers increasing, yes, that's going to be true in Mexico, it's going to be true in India, it's going to be true in Australia. We've seen the numbers of several of these countries, and as more women rise up, enter the foreign service and then rise up the ranks, in the next decade, you're going to see that parity is, that difference is really small. However, I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anyone here, is that not all women are feminists and not all men are non-feminists, right? And I say that again sitting in India, is that the Mexican ambassador, the German ambassador, the Swedish former ambassador, they've just changed, the Dutch, the Australian, some of the other countries, but these are the ones that came to mind immediately, they're all men. A lot of the gender leads in these embassies are all men. I work with all of them, and they're all fantastic. It doesn't matter if that position was a man or a woman, because they are coming from a position that says in their country that we have developed a structure, or we are in the process of developing a structure where our policy will be feminist, inclusive, and equitable, however you want to look at it. So it then rests with the office, with that desk. Whoever occupies that desk has a mandate that they have to implement, and that's a space and a world that we'd like to get to, right? It's not only about who is occupying that desk, and in that sense, I think Mexico is doing a fantastic job and has been doing a fantastic job, and working with Germany and some of the other countries, I would say they're moving in that direction. And so I just wanted to answer that.
Right.
I don't think I answered your question at all.
We'll come to
Nandita.
that, but I'm just going to maybe deflect that to you, Bettina, in terms of, you've done a lot of research, and IWDA has led research on the trajectories that different countries are using, including defining, and the questions of whether there are numbers on around the table, or are those numbers making the difference, is also critical. But in your work and your research, where do you find things are changing, and how do you think this might be changing, particularly now that we've heard from both Germany and Mexico? What is your research pointing to?
So the research is called Seeds to Roots, and really it was looking at trajectories to feminist foreign policy. And so at the time in 2020 when we conducted the research, there were only actually 5 countries with the declared feminist foreign policy. When we released it was 7, and now I believe it's 12. So the landscape's changing fast. So I'm speaking to the research that we did that looked specifically at Sweden, Canada, France, and Mexico. And what were the factors that led to a feminist foreign policy being declared? So number one, because our common thread to them, was a high-level political will for a bold announcement, noting that actually, in most cases, it took everyone by surprise. Number 2, a value-aligned leader, and we saw that a good example with Mexico, with the foreign minister who was formerly the mayor for Mexico City, who had taken a stance on abortion rights, on gay marriage, etc. I think the other one that's interesting is a pragmatic driver. We've seen that in France, where during the Me Too movement there was a need for the political establishment to make a stance, and so that was unannounceable for them. We've seen also the fourth factor is an opportunity for being on the world stage and using the world stage for that announcement. So Mexico did it with, you mentioned, Ambassador, the Generational Equality Forum, co-hosting the forum. France and Germany did it when the time that they were hosting the G7. And then the fifth one, which is really relevant for us as AWDA, and will be relevant to others on the panel, is the civil society creating the enabling environment. And so in that context, for us, putting this research into action, we established about a year ago the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition and developed some tactics and strategies that are really about trying to demonstrate a broad base here in Australia to support feminist foreign policy. And so we have been working on issues papers. We are going to, people like actually the Kubernein Institute have been contributing to issues papers that are looking at specific areas, like for example, India and Australia building relationships around progressing gender equality. But we're also using a number of other avenues through the members of the coalition and through AWDA to contribute to a number of blogs, whether it's the strategist, whether it's the diplomat, whether it's a dev policy blog. My throat is drying in the heat. And so, thank you. And so I think, we're trying, thank you so much. We're trying to use a number of avenues. The other one that's critical for us has been engaging around roundtables and political engagement. So we've had a roundtable with key actors like Penny Wong, our foreign minister, but obviously across all political parties here in Australia. And really, that's, I guess what I would say is, my observations is building on what has been shared so far. This was done in 2020. And so as I mentioned at the start, we now have about 12 countries. And we can see that some of the research, will need to be updated. And it's very interesting that with Germany, it's taken a very different approach, taking a year to consult. And that's, obviously really welcomed. But also we're seeing more global South countries as we, in the language that we use at AWDA, more countries from the majority world actually adopting the concept. And that will be very interesting to understand how it is shifting, broadening, changing the concept that we have of feminist foreign policy.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to you now, Ofa. And I was just, even as you were talking, Bettina, I'm kind of thinking, you have done some amazing research, and you were talking about the South-North partnership earlier and creating an equitable South-North partnership. Within that framing, and you have talked about having a feminist foreign policy as something being critical to an equitable South-North partnership. How would you think that can be framed by looking at how countries who are engaging with each other are framing their internal policies on issues of equity and right versus how then they engage externally with other partners to create this equitable partnership? Because the whole concept that you're talking about, decolonizing development, I think that's something interesting to really unpack and see how that plays out. So,
thank you. The research that I had talked about earlier, that I did with IWDA about equitable South-North partnerships, one of the key recommendations from the 35 women leaders who participated in the research was that there was a need for some kind of feminist policy, either from the Global North side or an internal feminist policy guiding how they build relationships with the Global North. With that said, I've had a lot of thinking because in a lot of the conversations that I had with the women, they did share how a lot of things is still confusing for them, and they wanted to understand feminism from a Pacific perspective. So from a Pacific-specific perspective, and they wanted the opportunity to develop this and not be dictated by the Western concept of feminism. And when I say this, just as I was hearing the conversations, in the Pacific, there's still a lot of confusion around gender mainstreaming. What does that exactly mean? And then the whole gender framework itself, gender bias, gender blind, gender discrimination, gender equality, gender equity, gender division of labor, the whole list can go on. And women's movements are still grappling their heads around that, trying to figure out, how do we understand this? These are foreign concepts that are given to us that we're supposed to understand. And for me, it's always a conversation around, these are just words, they're titles, they're labels. But the practice, you have been doing this since from time immemorial. And I think there's a risk here when we say feminist foreign policy, the fact that the word foreign is in it can even trigger negative reactions across the Pacific. The fact that, because they'll just identify it as something foreign. Just like how they've been pushing back women's rights language, human rights language, inclusiveness, diversity. There's a real big pushback because they feel that these concepts are foreign. So the question is, how do we make it specific Pacific? Because we've had great documents come out, let's say, for example, the Pacific Island Leaders Forum Gender Equality Declaration from 2012. How far have we progressed on that? In terms of women's political participation, ending violence against women, we have some of the highest numbers globally. And so just to have words there and fancy policies and commitments and agreements, how far have we come? And is the feminist foreign policy at risk of doing the same thing, of repeating the same pattern? So when we talk about feminist foreign policies, it's not just about numbers. It's not looking in this room and saying how many men are here. It's looking in this room and asking every single person here, do you understand patriarchy? And do you call it out when you see it? Because that's what feminism means to me. It doesn't matter whatever identity you have. It's the fact that you understand patriarchy and you're ready to smash it. And this is and if we think about the great movements in our history, if we think about the 32,000 signatures when Kate Shepherd moved those women in New Zealand for women's suffrage, the right to vote, they didn't have a feminist foreign policy. They had a women's movement on the ground, and they weren't labeling each other as feminists or what. They were all just women who came together, talked about the oppression that they were experiencing, talked about the struggles they were facing as mothers, as working women, as whatever roles they were playing, and they agreed that enough is enough. And let's make a movement forward and make a change and demand the change. And so I would say, if there's a feminist foreign policy, is it bold enough to go there? Or will it stay comfortably behind the line, just as all these other terms? We went from violence against women and we've diluted it to domestic violence, to family violence, and now we're packaging it as gender-based violence. People don't understand what is gender-based violence. When we took that away from violence against women, we took away the fact that women are disproportionately affected by violence. And so there's a whole lot of things I could go on, but I'm going to stop now. Yes.
Thank you. Well, I think we could just have a whole discussion on what you just talked about, Ofa. And I couldn't agree more with you in terms of how wording certain things can either completely derail the process or actually facilitate it if you manage to keep it in a context that's understandable. And I think that was also the story about, do we call it feminist or gendered? And I think you're right. The word feminist allows you to challenge patriarchy. And gender has actually, this is my personal view, don't take it as anything else. Gender, the word gender, I strongly feel has actually diluted the process and become more acceptable, but not actionable as we wanted. Taking that to you, Ambika, and then I'll also come to the ambassadors. This whole concept about how specific is it? Well, specific to the Pacific, specific to South Asia, specific to India. How specific do we need to get? What will make it contextual? You've been working on this in India, And I know that we've been in the room where we have been asked, whose agenda is it? The first question in a discussion, till you have to turn around and say, well, not really anybody's. If it is ours, and if you don't want to be in the room, then we can all go. But I think that's the kind of pushback. Where do you think we make that as a point of reflection, or how do we even move forward strategically?
Of course, Nandita will ask the really hard questions, right? Yes. So in 2019, when I started researching what a feminist foreign policy means, these were the questions that we were asking, we were being faced with, right? And there was, I think you said in 2019, it was 6 or 7 countries, and they were largely what one would consider global north countries, or sitting in India, they were transatlantic countries, right? Because there was Canada and Mexico. Now there are 12 that have announced or have announced an intention. And I think that's also really good, even if you haven't done that fully. An intention is really important because it sets you on that path. And I've written them down, and it's an equal split of countries, again, depending on how you want to define global south versus global north. But if you take a very standard, traditional UN-style definition, it's equal. So it's really important, I think, in just these 3.5 years, we have seen that shift in movement, which then allows other countries to see that there's a shift in thinking. There's a shift in approach, and there's a shift in how what this actually means. And I think Ofa brings up a really important point about you have to be bold, but you have to be bold in a context that makes sense to your country or your region. And that is, there's no direct answer to Nandita's question, and hopefully I will have an answer, from an Indian perspective, but the half answer right now is that, yes, context matters without derailing from that important point of pushing the barrier as much as you can. When you work in a country like India and many others, you have to be a little bit careful as to how you push that barrier, where you're pushing that barrier. And that then, so that it allows you to say, okay, I'll push it to a certain extent, let enough people come in the room, let me incept all of these wonderful ideas into their heads, the ones who are a little bit on the fence, the ones who don't understand, the ones who are critical but not closed off, and then open that door a little bit more, gather some more people, right? So sometimes it's a very slow process. The kind of terminology and language that one uses may or may not be the same as other countries are using, but it is important in that country, in that context, in that time period. And that's constantly an evolving process. And so I think that's really important to remember. The other thing that's important to remember is that for a very long time, I was constantly saying, you cannot have a feminist foreign policy that's meant to be inclusive, but only sit in Europe and talk about it. Your feminist foreign policy is not feminist or inclusive at all if the rest of the world has no idea what you're doing, if the rest of the world has no input into what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, what is it? It's foreign policy. It's not domestic policy. In which case, then yes, you're allowed to do whatever you want within, I would hope, ethical, moral guidelines. But it's foreign policy, which means you're going to take that policy and you're going to come to India, you're going to come to the Pacific Islands, to Australia, to Latin America, and you're going to implement that foreign policy. How can you say it's a feminist foreign policy when it's going to go all around the world, but had no input from that world that you want to implement it with? And so in that case, what Germany is doing, what the Netherlands is doing, other countries that have announced an intent, like Chile, for example. I don't think a lot of people thought Chile would go down this path, but they have announced an intent, and they're doing it in a way that says, okay, let's think about what it means both as a feminist perspective, as smashing the patriarchy perspective, but also it is foreign policy. How do I bring all of these things together? So how do I talk to my partners in that? So I think then your partner's context, your partner's realities also play a very important role in how you then design what your feminist foreign policy is. without, at the end of the day, having that base, very core value system that says equity, inclusion, and collective human and environment security. And I think that's what that original intent of what a feminist foreign policy is. And in places like the Pacific Islands and in India and many parts of the world, we've been doing this for decades. There is a very strong feminist movement in India that goes back decades. What we are trying to do is, at Kubernein, is also try and understand that movement and bring it into that foreign policy making space, both for India, but also then for other countries that want to work with India in that feminist foreign policy bucket. Again, I will stop.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know that we have heard from all the eminent speakers, and there's a lot to mull over, and there's a lot to think. But I'm now going to give this amazing audience the space and time to really grill the panel and ask more and ramp up the temperature.
Yes. I'm originally from Sri Lanka, worked on women, peace and security for about 10 years, and now I'm a student doing my master's in peace and conflict studies at the University of Queensland. So my first question is to Andreas. From a feminist perspective where militarism, patriarchy and capitalism is addressed, I would like to know whether feminist foreign policy sort of paved the way for an anti-militarist approach towards sustainable international peace. Okay, I'll just read out my question. Yeah, because you spoke about the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, and you also mentioned about sustainable international peace, so I'm quite interested because I just wrote an essay for my foreign policy and diplomacy course on why Afghanistan need a feminist foreign policy. So my question is whether you see feminist foreign policy paving the way for an anti-militarist approach for sustainable international peace, where budget allocations are moved from defense to gender equality. And my second question is, okay.
Thank you. Michael Wilson, I'm from a company called eWater Limited, but I used to be the gender equality coordinator at an agency called AusAid. Some people might remember. The question I'd like to ask anyone on the panel, I'm tempted to put it to the diplomats, but it might be a bit unfair, is there's a sense from the presentations today that that this movement is irreversible, that it's on a constant trajectory to optimistic progressivism. But it would seem to me that it's not that simple. It's not that long ago, you said Australia was doing well, but it's not that long ago we had a cabinet of 18 men and 1 woman, and that 1 woman eschewed the heritage of feminism in terms of what had made a difference in her life and career. She's now the Chancellor of this university and about to throw a bolt of lightning at me. Or the look. So how do we, is it irreversible? It seems obvious that this is how we should be travelling and seems obvious where the end point should be. But that's not how it is in lots of parts of the world. And how do we guard against that? What are the signs that the consensus around building a feminist foreign policy might be eroding?
Because the first one's already tough enough. I mean, very, very bluntly put, I mean, we are making policy in the world that we live in and not the world as we would like it to be. And I've pointed out that obviously the Green Party as part of the German government is a party that has a certain very progressive attitude to this particular issue. But it's also a party that comes from a very pacifist tradition. I don't need to point out what kind of situation we are currently in Europe with hot war having returned to our doorstep with Russia's illegal aggression. This puts a lot of strain into our politics and also into politics of that particular government coalition. But not so much on the Greens, interestingly. So the Green Party has actually been a bit driving the federal government towards being more supportive on the military side for Ukraine. So it's a very complex setup in which we would be discussing this. But when I say bluntly, we have to make politics for the world that we live in and not the one as we would like it to be. We will have to doing things at the same time. And that means we need to make sure that this war doesn't spill, and we need to give Ukraine the means to fight back against this illegal occupation. But that doesn't mean that we can't pursue these kind of objectives at the same time. And it's exactly the same actually in our energy policy, right? I mean, with we had the dependence on Russian carbo fuels, and because the gas is now cut off from Russia, we have to make some rearrangements, which for a brief period of time means that we actually have to use more coal. But we, at the same time, want to pursue the policy to get out of carbon-based fuels as quickly as we can. So we need to arrange these things at the same time. I would say from memory and historically speaking, the Green Party has time and again been a bit at the forefront. The first ever time that Germany went into a hot war situation after World War II was in 1999 in Kosovo. And again, it was the Green Party that had the Foreign Office at the time. People were surprised that the party that for a large part of its tradition comes out of pacifism did that, but they did it by having a very, very painful discussion about conflicting objectives that we sometimes need to work with. And I think our policy always needs to be to make transparent the conflicting objectives that we sometimes have. And like very bluntly put in that case at the time, it was put, yes, we say no to war, but we also say no to Auschwitz or never again Auschwitz, right? And you need to take decisions in this kind of context.
Thank you. The next question was, no, we have to answer the other question. Bettina, would you like to? Ambassador, yeah, if you'd like to answer that, yes.
Well, I only want to say that the feminist foreign policy is an instrument. And as we know, the modern state was built by men. It's a men construction, and it is a paternalistic institution. And it has not worked very well because most of the important decisions around the world are taken by men. For example, the Ukraine war was taken by a man. And we have to change that. Decisions should be taken by women and men in groups that are equal. Otherwise, we are not going to succeed. Climate change is an example of decisions that were badly taken many, many years ago. Those decisions were taken by men. So we need to change that.
I think the important construct here, and I'm going to again deflect the questions to somebody in the team here, basically to say if the construct of patriarchy is what defines power and nation states, then how true are we to believe that this construct of feminist foreign policy is something we will be able to push through, as was asked?
Yeah, so a couple of things I want to build on. First, to specifically speak to this, I think that what we saw with Sweden in 2014 is really centering of gender equality, rights, representation, resources what we're speaking about when we're talking for us about feminist foreign policy is really about power dynamics and speaking, about disrupting power. So yes, women's rights, gender equality, key central aims, but actually an intersectional approach that is really looking at disrupting power goes much further, and that's what we're looking for, and that's what connects also to some of the issues that Ofa has raised around decoloniality. So, and that connects us here in Australia to a First Nation foreign policy, and what would it mean to have First Nation foreign policy? I just want to say, I think for me, backlash is real. We can see that in global trends, the rise of authoritarianism. We see it at the UN Multilateral Forum, where we see conservative governments are really connecting with anti-rights, anti-gender movements, and harnessing power. Sweden took down its feminist foreign policy website within, I think, 2 days. Italy, we know where it's going. We saw what happened in the US. So I think there is absolutely no sense that, and it will be interesting to hear, from colleagues, that actually this number of 11 or 12 is really an indication of progress. What it means is that there is some galvanizing around it. It means that when Sweden goes the other way, the concept doesn't fall because others can hold the space. But until we really go to the heart of power, rather than just naming it as gender, I don't think we will go far enough. So.
Ofa.
Yeah, just to add on the backlash, of course, absolutely. And I think to quickly name the elephant in the room, that feminism is still very a white woman's domain. And unfortunately, it is what it is. You saw the black woman in America coming out with womanism because they felt that feminism lacked a perspective on intersectionality and how race, culture, social status, disability, all these intersecting issues impact our lives. And so if we don't move away, like for me, my Pacific sisters who understand feminism either studied it at university or they're in an elite NGO who have access to those resources information. The vast majority of women in the grassroots level do not understand feminism, but their actions are like what I said earlier. These are women who are movers and shakers, who are making things happen and can make and demand change. And so we need to go back to the consciousness awareness raising at the grassroots level, because when there's a backlash, that movement will rise up. And we're clearly missing that. Donors don't want to fund movement building. They don't want us to go into communities and raise the consciousness of women to identify the oppression that we are still living in. The fact that we still can't own land, and women can't own land, lautoa. That's a big issue for us in Tonga. But no one wants to talk about it. Just stick to women's economic empowerment, ending violence against women, increasing women's political participation. But when you go into spaces where it's a bit too sensitive for their relationship between our governments, they don't want to touch it. But if we want to see change, this is how we do it.
Thank you. We have another quick round, 2 questions. Oh, okay. We have a hand there. Yeah. Did I see anybody else? Sorry. Yeah, can I keep this here first? Because I think. Okay. If you don't mind.
Okay, thank you so much for the chance. I'm very happy and glad to be here. I'm Revita, I'm from Indonesia. Feminist in Indonesia is very, very lack, I think. I'm as woman with disabilities, and I'm facing a lot of discrimination in my country. As a woman, and also as a disabled. So double discrimination that I'm facing. And a lot of women in Indonesia who are not disabled, not involving us and not making us involved as me as a disabled person. So I'm feeling left behind by other feminists. We as women with disabilities, we actually want to joining with feminist movements in Indonesia. I want to ask about your experience involving women with disabilities in your movements. And I'm hoping that all movements, all feminist movements will involving people with disabilities also in their movements. That's what I'm hoping. Thank you so much.
Right. Wonderful. We'll take your question as well, and then I will defer to the group to answer the first one.
Thank you. I'm Jessica Revlon from IOM. We've got the policy itself, obviously, in a few countries at least, and this discussion, which is powerful. But other than that, I'd love to hear any examples or experiences that you have of incentivizing and celebrating good, holistically feminist implementation or action by foreign services, by the second secretary or the program officer, because I'm hearing of as example of what would be written down as part of the 8% of empowering women doing exactly the opposite. And I'm seeing a lot of development assistance that doesn't work to shift that power. And so we really need this to be not only talked about, as you've said, but also implemented on a person-to-person basis in a way that is too qualitative, too messy to just use a number for. So any sort of incentives for actual people to take this power and give it away in their role, or do other things in that vein, and incentives of where that's worked, even just a little bit, would be amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. The first question, in terms of engaging women who are differently able as a part of a feminist movement and how that impacts. Ambika?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what we try to do, and thank you, I think that's a really important question. I have to confess, when we started in India looking at research within India as to what a feminist foreign policy would look like, I'd like to say when India gets on this path and not if, but I'm an eternal optimist. So we did start from a pure gender lens. We looked at the numbers and all of that. But we also realized it was important to understand what was the background of feminist movements in India itself, going back 150 years. And so we engaged with experts who studied those movements. And a lot of the movements and so if we go back 150 years, it's not India, then it's South Asia. And a lot of those movements were very inclusive in nature. So we learned from those examples of what has happened in the past and how those movements included all vulnerable groups that they saw in their immediate surroundings. So that could be women, men, young people, old people, different ethnicities, different class, different caste, disability, marginalized groups at the borders, tribal communities. I mean, it depended on where that movement was located. They were being very inclusive. And so we took those tools and have tried to bring that into the work that we are doing now. Decidedly, it's a little bit difficult because, as you know, in India, several languages. So it's becomes then the problem that Ofa was talking about earlier about being able to do this work and not have a lot of people coming to give me a lot of money to be able to do this work, but within what we are able to, we are trying to do that. And I think that lens and those tools then become really useful. We've also studied some very old feminist movements in other parts of the world because I think they had very interesting tools that we can adapt to a more modern context. So we are trying in that sense to take that forward. Yeah. And I can speak of a few other organizations that we are connected to in other parts of the world. I know we are all exchanging these tools and these ideas. So there is some understanding and movement in that regard.
Thank you. Ofa, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly that diversity is a fact. Social inclusion is a choice. So for my organization, we always set out to include women living with disabilities in Tonga, so that's not in question. They're always involved in our activities, and we know and understand that it's quite complex, and to understand that we have to have those conversations around the table and listen carefully to what they're telling us. Just quickly on what you asked, I think I'm just going to end off quickly with a nice story from Tonga. I was supposed to share this with my good friend Lauto here tonight over a glass of wine, but I guess because you asked the question, I'll say it here because I don't. She's fully looking at me. It was some good news that I came from Tonga. For the last 13 years, we have been working and advocating quite progressively to amend the definition of rape in our law, because it was a 1927 law that still defined rape as penile penetration. So we had been working towards changing this law and amending it and including all forms of rape. To cut a long story short, the current Australian High Commissioner to Tonga, Rachel Moore, who's a feminist, we started off nurturing our relationship. We got into deep conversations. We talked about my frustrations, my struggles. She talked about her experiences in different countries. And she just moved quietly and got all the right people to spaces where she invited me to talk. And it was quite intimate spaces, but it was the right people who we needed in the room. And over the last 2 years, we worked quietly at it. And just 2 weeks ago, we were told that it was passed in Parliament. So, sorry, Lauta, I was supposed to share this with you. Because it has been a long, long journey. And when you asked that question, I just had to acknowledge Rachel Moore. And she's a white woman with her heart in the right place, and broke down barriers with me, nurtured our relationship, and made sure that she used her power where she needed to use it. And we got this over the line. So for all the women and girls in Tonga, Lautoa, who's been an advocate for years as well and before moving out, and everyone, people with living with disabilities, LGBTQI+, non-gender conforming, everyone is covered under this new definition. So there you go.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful note to end this conversation on. I think it just says, you said it, Ofa, we all have it, we have the power, it's how you use it. And I think understanding how you use it means that really making the choice to address the realities that exist, and the realities are not equal. So the choice has to be towards equality. So with that, I want to thank this eminent panel of speakers, the amazing audience, and the organizers for giving us a chance to really talk about this issue in so much depth, with so much passion, and all the love that we bring to the room. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.